Hello friends, my name is JJ. And does anyone in Canada really care if Quebec leaves or not anymore? That's the question that's been on my mind lately, as our French-speaking province has begun openly plotting to unilaterally adopt a new constitution that would make it an independent country in all but name, while the reaction of the rest of Canada has basically been that meme of Donald Duck sleeping cozily in bed. So, what gives? What exactly is Quebec doing, and why does nobody care? Isn't this supposed to be the defining drama of Canadian politics? So why is a Quebec Declaration of Independence now basically like a page B12 story? The answer may shock you, or maybe not. Canadian politics is pretty silly these days. So in my opinion, one of the most underrated stories in the Western world has been the rise of François Legault as Prime Minister of Quebec. Since the 2010s, the West has seen the emergence of a number of populist nationalist leaders in many places, including Orban in Hungary, Meloni in Italy, Nigel Farage in England, and of course Trump in the US. Canada, by contrast, has often been held up as having been immune to this global trend, in the sense that it has repeatedly re-elected the center-left Liberal Party to power during this era, a party that loves immigration and diversity and wokeness and all of these sorts of things. But this is only part of the story. In 2018, a significant chunk of Canadians, which is to say the residents of Canada's second largest province of Quebec, elected François Legault to power, a man who had created a brand new political party, the Coalition for the Future of Quebec, as a vehicle for his own unique nationalist political agenda. It was the first time in more than 40 years that an outsider party had been elected to govern Quebec. So Quebec politics can be a little bit difficult to describe ideologically, just because they really don't have the same tradition of left versus right politics as we do in the rest of Canada. On a lot of social and economic issues, I feel like the conventional wisdom is to say that the Quebec center of political gravity is pretty far to the left of the Canadian mainstream, but then on issues relating to nationalism, they are pretty far to the right. And Legault would be on the further end of the nationalist spectrum, which is often seen as the only spectrum that seems to matter in Quebec politics. Quebec is, of course, the only majority French-speaking part of Canada, and is sometimes held up as being the homeland of a unique North American ethnic group, the French Canadians. So that has always given the place a pretty unique sense of itself relative to the rest of Canada. And this is the soil from which Quebec nationalism grows. Quebec nationalists, like most nationalists, tend to be animated by some desire to keep their asserted homeland pure in some way, to avoid as much as possible the influences and even presence of peoples whose traditions of language, religion, dress, and so on conflict with some idealized sense of the sort of place that Quebec is supposed to be. On the most extreme end of the Quebec nationalist spectrum, you have outright separatists who want Quebec to leave Canada and become a separate country. And then on the opposite end, you have anti-separatists, or as they are sometimes known in Canadian political jargon, federalists, who are loyal to Canada and the idea of Quebec being a province of Canada just like all of the others. That is the platonic ideal of the Quebec political spectrum, at least. In practice, I would say that a great deal of real-world Quebec politicians sit somewhere in the middle, what I would call the special deal for Quebec people, wherein Quebec remains part of Canada, but also works out some sort of special deal with the Canadian government, where they get unique powers and privileges that no other Canadian province has. The ideology of Premier Legault, in turn, is basically to the right of this, where Quebec just unilaterally gives itself new powers and doesn't involve Canada at all. Legault is a former separatist, and his theory of the case today seems to be that it is possible for Quebec to obtain all of the powers of an independent nation without going through the protracted Brexit-esque logistical headaches and sacrifices of something as complicated as a formal national divorce. During his 8 years in office, Legault has slowly accelerated his use of unilateral decision-making to obtain these powers for his province. First, by testing the limits of the tools that the Constitution of Canada offers. For instance, to prevent Quebec Muslims and Sikhs from wearing head coverings on public property, which he views as being against Quebec culture. He passed legislation using a rarely used provision in the Canadian Constitution that allows for the passing of laws that violate basic civil rights. Similarly, in order to entrench his idea of Quebec being the nation-state of the French Canadians, where French is the only acceptable language, he made a rather dubious use of a different part of the Canadian Constitution that says that provinces can, in limited circumstances, make unilateral changes to the Constitution, so long as these changes only affect their part of the country. So according to Legault, he has now made a couple of lines about Quebec being a nation of French speakers, part of the Canadian Constitution. Although this is so legally dubious that I noticed the Canadian government's own official text of the Constitution puts the Legault amendments in italics, which if you ask me is pretty emblematic of the sort of polite humoring that Legault has received from the Canadian political establishment over the years, which we will discuss more later. When Charles III became King of England, Legault announced that he had made another amendment to the Canadian Constitution, saying that Quebec politicians no longer needed to swear an oath of allegiance to the British monarch. This was very obviously unlawful, because for good or ill, oaths to the British monarch are explicitly stated to be mandatory for all politicians in Canada, and thus clearly beyond the realm of something that can be said to only affect one province. This amendment also got the italics treatment. And now Premier Legault has made his most audacious move yet. Earlier this month, he released a draft Quebec Constitution that will proclaim Quebec a free state that operates entirely on its own terms, rejecting all burdens of the Canadian legal and political system it doesn't like, and gaining complete power over everything it wants to control. And there is no universe in which a move like this is remotely lawful in the Canadian system. Provinces cannot just create brand new political regimes for themselves. They have to operate within the limits of provincial power established by the Canadian Constitution. But Premier Legault fully intends to get his constitution passed by the Quebec legislature at some point in the new year. And if he does, and if no one puts up much resistance to him doing so, in my opinion, that will represent a very significant breakdown of the Canadian system and the establishment of Quebec as this weird sort of legal no man's land in which Canadian law has basically stopped applying to 20% of the country. But before we take a closer look at what exactly this proposed constitution says, let us just hear a quick word from today's video sponsor, Surfshark. Oh, hello friends! You just caught me loading up my shelves with some fresh knickknacks. People often ask me where I get all of this stuff, and the fact is I just really like shopping, especially online. The problem, however, is that shopping online can be a bit of a risky business, especially if you're doing your online shopping in some public place, like at a coffee shop or on the train, which I will confess is something I often do when I'm bored. Whenever you buy something online, you are sending out a lot of private information, including your home address and credit card number, which can be a pretty irresponsible thing to do if you don't have faith that your internet connection is secure. Is someone around me maybe intercepting or hijacking this connection to get access to my data? Luckily, there is a very simple tool that all online security experts recommend, a VPN like the one provided by our good pals at Surfshark. When you use Surfshark's VPN app on your computer or phone, you get peace of mind knowing your internet connection is hyper secure. It not only encrypts your data by routing it through Surfshark's secure servers, it also masks your location by hiding your connection's IP address that exposes where you are. And that's only the beginning, because Surfshark also offers all of these other features like virus scanning and ad blocking as well. And if this sounds like something you'd be into, do I have the promo for you? If you click on the link in the thing below or use this QR code and sign up for a 24-month subscription at surfshark.com/JJMCC using the promo code JJMCC, you can get an additional 4 months absolutely free. And don't forget, Surfshark has a 30-day money-back guarantee. So don't delay, make your online experience more secure, and give Surfshark a try today. So Premier Legault's proposed constitution is divided into 6 parts, with the first part being the actual draft text of the Constitution itself, and the other 5 parts describing how it will all work in the real world. And one of the first things that strikes you about the text of the draft Constitution is the complete absence of any mention of Canada. It doesn't define Quebec as part of Canada, or Quebecers as Canadians, or even make any sentimental references to the shared history of Quebecers and Canadians, or anything like that. Instead, it simply says, Quebec is a free national state capable of assuming its destiny and ensuring its development. Now, I'm reading from the Quebec government's official English translation of the Constitution, but keep in mind that in the future Free State of Quebec, the only authoritative version will be in French, since Article 21 says the only official language of Quebec is French. Overall, this draft constitution is aggressively nationalistic in character. Articles 3 and 4 say that the people of Quebec form a nation, and the territory of Quebec is the historical homeland of the nation and constitutes its common heritage. The Constitution, accordingly, does not view the protection of individual rights as its primary goal, but rather preserving the intrinsic and inalienable collective rights of the Quebec nation. Articles 19 and 20 accordingly say that the main purpose of the Quebec government is to protect the fundamental characteristics of Quebec and ensure the protection of the common heritage of the Quebec nation. Canadian political history nerds may recall that this whole business of giving Quebecers collective rights based on their supposed fundamental characteristics was explicitly rejected by Canadian voters in a national referendum in 1992, which I made a whole other video about a few years ago. The Free State of Quebec apparently wants to govern itself using something that resembles the same parliamentary system they currently use, although it doesn't get into too much detail. The head of the government is the Prime Minister of Quebec, and the head of the state is the Officer of Quebec, or l'officier, and she is appointed directly by the Prime Minister. The Constitution's preamble says that Quebec rejects monarchy as a form of government, and there is no reference to the King of Great Britain, the King of Canada, as having any role in the Quebec system. The Constitution's Chapter 5, meanwhile, gives the Quebec government the power to make foreign policy for itself and says that only the state of Quebec may bind Quebec to another state. Elsewhere, the Free State Constitution affirms a couple of other interesting things about the sort of society that Quebec intends to be. Article 29 affirms a woman's right to an abortion, for instance, while Article 22 says that Quebec is a lay or secular state, which was the argument about Quebec culture that was used to justify the ban on religious head coverings that I mentioned earlier. Article 30 contains the sole mention of Canada and says that in Quebec, immigrants will face integration into the Quebec nation, with this being rather gratuitously described as different from Canadian multiculturalism. Secularism, the French language, assimilation of immigrants, and a rejection of English common law in favor of French civil law are the things that are most often cited by the Constitution as being the core values of the Quebec nation. Though the Free State of Quebec clearly intends to be some manner of French-Canadian supremacist society, it does acknowledge some other cultural communities as well. The preamble promises that the Free State of Quebec will be respectful of the institutions of the English-speaking community of Quebec, as well as the existing ancestral and treaty rights of the Indigenous nations of Quebec. But it doesn't obligate itself to do anything to strengthen or empower these groups, which comes in contrast to Article 50, which says that the government of Quebec will actively support the growth of Francophone and Acadian communities, using the traditional terms for French-Canadian people. 5 long legal addendums are attached to this draft constitution, and they attempt to clarify how this idea of the Free State of Quebec can be made to work in a place that is still legally part of Canada. And I'm no fancy big city lawyer, but this clearly entails some pretty creative understanding of how Canadian law works, which is to say, it entails an understanding of Canadian law in which whatever Quebec wants to do to maximize its power is entirely legal and possible and requires no compromises whatsoever. Long story short, the addendums basically explain that while the Free State of Quebec might seem like it would run afoul of all sorts of Canadian laws and the Canadian Constitution, that is actually not a problem because, as it turns out, the Quebec government has the power to simply delete or ignore any legal burdens that would get in the way of building this new Free State. Part 4 of the addendum, for instance, simply goes through the Canadian Constitution and says that Quebec is hereby deleting any lines that contradict the powers described in the Constitution of the Quebec Free State. Now, surely this sort of thing is going to open the Quebec government up to a lot of lawsuits, you might be thinking, but au contraire. Article 9, Part 2 says that if Quebec passes a law that it declares to be under its exclusive parliamentary sovereignty, then no Canadian court is allowed to overturn it. Article 17, Part 2, likewise gives the Quebec government broad authority to refuse to comply with any federal initiative that causes the federal state, i.e. Canada, to intrude into an area under the constitutional jurisdiction of Quebec. Even more audaciously, Section 25 says that Quebec doesn't even have to obey any international treaty or agreement that Canada signs if it deems it to be pertaining to a matter under Quebec's jurisdiction. Section 5, Part 2, meanwhile, says that the Quebec Prime Minister has the right to appoint Quebec's senators to the Canadian Senate, as well as the 3 Quebec judges who sit on the Canadian Supreme Court, all of whom are currently appointed by the Prime Minister of Canada. What all this adds up to is a dramatically new Canada, in which we go from being a country of 10 equal provinces to a country of 9 provinces and this other thing that exists within our borders, and basically does whatever it wants. It will obey Canadian laws when it feels like it, and reject them when it doesn't. But one thing it definitely won't do is reject any revenue it gets from Canada. It's pretty telling that, as far as I can see, no part of building the Free State of Quebec involves divorcing itself from any of the funding streams that the federal entity currently provides Quebec, which according to their most recent provincial budget is set to hit $32 billion in the next fiscal year, or about 20% of Quebec's total revenue. So I really don't know how to describe this particular project of Premier Legault's other than a breathtakingly arrogant and entitled attempt to exploit and manipulate a country that he clearly feels very little loyalty to, yet is too cowardly and cynical to actually abandon. Canada's constitution is rather notoriously difficult to change. To modify anything substantial, there has to be a pretty broad consensus among most of the provincial governments. This is designed to ensure that when fundamental changes are made to Canada's political system, changes that affect things like the rights of citizens or our democratic procedures and checks and balances, those changes enjoy the buy-in of a diverse set of shareholders in Canadian society. And that bar is so high that only one constitutional amendment has been passed in the 40 years that this amending process has been in place. This fact has been of particular frustration to a string of nationalist governments in Quebec, which, like I said earlier, have all tended to share a consensus that Quebec needs more powers to do more of what it wants, which in turn reflects the opinion of a pretty broad consensus of Quebec voters. And in the face of this daunting challenge to change the Canadian system, Premier Legault has built his political brand on the equivalent of offering voters cake and ice cream instead of diet and exercise. His theory was that if Quebec just did things, if it just ignored Canadian law and just said it had new powers without going through any sort of proper process for obtaining them, the Canadian political establishment would probably be too passive to push back. And that assumption does appear to have been borne out. Both of Canada's main national political parties, the Liberals and the Conservatives, have shown basically no interest in speaking out against anything that Premier Legault has done over the years. At worst, they ignore him. At best, they nervously praise him, like Bart's family does in that one episode of The Simpsons where he has the superpowers.
Oh, there, that's better. Much better. Oh, good, the curtains are on fire.
It's good that you made that awful thing, Bart.
And this is because both of the national parties really want Quebec voters to like them. The Liberal Party is very dependent on Quebec votes to win elections, owing to the province's more left-wing tilt on a number of issues. The Conservative Party is not, but they are still obsessed with winning votes there anyway, for what I would describe as insecure patriotic reasons. The party really doesn't want to be thought of as one that French-Canadian voters don't like, even though they don't. So Legault is either praised for being such a staunch champion of the proud Quebec people, or just ignored in order to avoid inflaming him more. And in my opinion, this makes Canada's political establishment quite complicit in the slow erosion of our national constitution and the transformation of Canada into a country with a much more arbitrary rule of law. Now, what does your average Canadian think about all of this? Well, the short answer is not much. Though about 2 out of 10 Canadians live in Quebec, that still means that 80% do not. And I feel it's become a place that's gotten pretty easy to ignore. Successive Quebec governments have explicitly tried to build their province into a much more insular, isolated sort of place. Migration from other provinces tends to be very low, in large part because of how strict and off-putting their French-only language laws for everything are. Quebec's near total rejection of the mainstream Canadian political party system has likewise made Quebec politics feel increasingly exotic and complicated. And I feel like the Canadian news media just doesn't cover Quebec stuff all that much. The 80% of non-Quebec Canadians, of course, have no shortage of problems of their own to deal with these days. Significant problems involving stuff like jobs and the cost of living, which make Quebec's dissatisfaction with the Canadian political system a concern of pretty low priority by comparison. And I'm sorry to say that I think it is also true that to the extent that the rest of Canada is aware of what the Quebec government is up to, it strikes a lot of people as so preposterous and spoiled, and even somewhat delusional, that it's worth ignoring in just a kind of exhausted, resentful way, the way you might ignore a child who's throwing a temper tantrum. But I don't think it should be ignored, because as much as I might personally consider Premier Legault to be an arrogant and delusional and in many ways a quite stupid and simple man, it is important that those of us who want Canada to be a country with a strong constitution and a strong rule of law and a strong federal system of equal provinces like our founders intended, it is important to call out bad actors who seek to undermine any of this. Even if you don't care much about Quebec, I can assure you that an independent Quebec constitution will not be the only problem to come from a Canada that has abandoned its founding principles. So, here is the interesting epilogue of this story. Though Premier Legault's plan for an independent Quebec constitution is very popular with Quebec voters, he himself is not. His party's large majority in the Quebec legislature means it will be easy for him to get his constitution passed in early 2026, which is the current timeline. But in October of 2026, there is scheduled to be a Quebec general election in which current polls suggest that Premier Legault is likely to lose his bid for a third term. And what makes this interesting is that a lot of opposition to Legault has actually come from parties more nationalist than him, with the party Québécois, which supports outright separation from Canada, currently leading in the polls. What this suggests to me is that there is no sign that the acceleration of arbitrary government in Quebec is likely to decelerate anytime soon. Even if support for formal separation remains low, the election of a government that holds the idea of Quebec being a province of Canada in even lower regard than Premier Legault does suggests that future relations between Quebec and the rest of Canada are likely to become even more troubled and dysfunctional before they get better. The upside, however, is that while the Canadian political elite has been wary of criticizing Premier Legault, an outright separatist Prime Minister of Quebec remains seen as something so unpatriotic and dangerous that I could imagine the election of such a person triggering the release of a lot of pent-up frustration with the province, and with it, resistance to its any further use of unlawful, arbitrary political power. So, we'll see. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know if there are any other Canadian stories you would like to see me cover, and I will see you next week.